X-Files. Our X-Files. Welcome to Our X-Files Vault. Regular people talking about unexplained phenomena. UFOs. Ghosts. Cryptids. Hidden archaeology. Weird science. Our stories. Our takes. Our X-Files Vault.
Welcome to our X-Files, where we discuss unexplained phenomena, both from a serious and entertaining point of view. And we also like to share our own experiences with the strange and unexplained. Today we're with our special guests, David White and Danielle. I'm not sure of her last name. Maybe we can add that in after, but it's Danielle who operates a website. Let me look it up. Called watch.sightings.live. It's a popular website where people can post their footage or their encounters with UFO sightings. So to introduce Danielle, her goal is to drench the world in an abundance of incontrovertible proof of UFOs so that the concept of a UFO becomes credible. She's open to theories about what these things visiting us might be, whether they're from another world or from a breakaway civilization here at home. She can get into that later, maybe. The project is her way of crowdsourcing the science of UFOs by building a repository of current evidence recorded with widely available tools such as cell phones. Whether the government knows and doesn't want to tell us, or whether the government is just too clumsy to take on the evidence in a productive way, Danielle wants to put the science in the hands of citizens. So hi, Danielle. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
And then I want to introduce also David White, who has spent more than 20 years researching various subjects from ancient history, archaeology, and military matters to politics, quantum physics, UFOs or UAPs as they're now called, and almost every conspiracy subject you can name. He's also written numerous screenplays and several novels and has consulted on feature film projects. Hi, Dave. Thanks for coming.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Kev.
All right. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to go over the Watchers today on today's subject. And then we're going to go over this mysterious cognitive revolution that happened 70,000 years ago. And after which our species came to dominate the Earth. So we're going to go over what happened potentially during that cognitive revolution. And we're going to also hear about a personal encounter Dave experienced with a UFO. If Danielle has one, I'm not sure. She can share it with us too. And then finally, I'm going to pose a challenge to these guys. I'm going to call it the Noah Challenge. And this is based on a post that I saw that Dave, who's very active on Quora, left. He has some excellent articles there. So the first question is I guess we'll start with David. What are these watchers? They're referred to in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and they're perhaps hinted at in other cultures, such as the Inca or the Aztecs, or perhaps Egypt or the ancient Babylonians. What are these watchers, and are they aliens, or is this just mythical stuff? What are they, and what are they watching?
Okay, so let's back up a little bit before we talk about how the Bible describes the Nephilim and the Watchers. The Bible's first 5 books, which is called the Pentateuch by Hebrew scholars, wasn't compiled until the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon around 590 BC or so. They were in captivity for about 60, 70 years. During that time period, they first compiled the written form of what we now know as the first 5 books of the Bible. They were considered to have been written by Moses, except Moses lived many hundreds of years before. Some say around 600 years before. So until the time when it's written down, these stories are passed down orally, through oral tradition. Before that, we believe that those stories were based off of traditions from the city of Ur that were carried by Abraham and his people, his family, from Ur into Canaan to the Holy Land around 1900 BC. So we have around 400 years between when Abraham leaves Ur until the Babylonian captivity, and then actually another 400 or 500 years until the first version of the Hebrew Old Testament is compiled in something called the Septuagint, which is supposed to be the 70 or 72 Jewish scholars who compiled the original first extant Hebrew Old Testament. And that doesn't happen until around 300 BC. So there's at least 1600 years of these stories being passed around, changed, modified. And there appears now to have been at least 2,000 years before Abraham leaving Ur, where these stories are written in Sumerian legend. The story of Noah, the story of the flood, all of these predate Abraham by maybe 2,000 years. And we can see comparisons between the Noah story, for example, and the Sumerian legends of what might have been the same exact event. We now know with Göbekli Tepe being dated to somewhere around 9,000 or 10,000 BC, that there are possibly earlier versions of these stories, or the events that caused the Sumerians to record these stories, that might be 5,000 or 6,000 years before Sumeria. By the time it gets into the Old Testament, we're talking, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years has transpired. And it may be that we are hearing bits and fragments of earlier history only partially understood. There are only a handful of mentions of the Nephilim and the Watchers in the Bible. There's 3 mentions of the Nephilim, one in Genesis, one in, let me see my notes here, in Numbers, and another one in Ezekiel. They're not really well described. They're thought to be the fallen angels from whom these giants are born, as they have relations with the women of men, the supposedly beautiful women that seduce them with their beauty. There are reports that when Moses is bringing the Israelites into the Holy Land, he sends 10 scouts north, and when one of them comes back, he reports that there are giants living in Lebanon, or that area, that in their eyes, these humans, the Israelites, appear like grasshoppers. There's one description in a comparison study of the Old Testament that suggests that these beings were 15 feet tall and 6 feet wide, which does not sound like humans. However, it does sound like the old story of David and Goliath, where Goliath was one of these people from the Bekaa Valley, where we have the trilithons at this one massive platform, where these stones were 1,000 tons. And we have other buildings there where the doorways were of a massive size, 12 to 15 feet tall. There appears to be some sort of worldwide memory of giants as well. We have giants with red hair that are mentioned in Mayan legend. We have giants that are mentioned in Native American legends. We have giants that are mentioned in China and other parts of Asia. It's not clear whether these giants are the Nephilim or their offspring. It's still a matter of debate how we interpret those handful of lines in the Old Testament that talk about the Nephilim. The Watchers, though, is something a little different. There are 2 primary locations where they discuss the Watchers. One is where Daniel, who's writing during the Babylonian captivity about Nebuchadnezzar, who was one of the Babylonian kings, writes about a being who is watching what's going on with Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel interprets this watcher as telling Nebuchadnezzar he's going to be punished by Daniel's God, by Yahweh, by Jehovah. But that doesn't appear to be a direct connection with the Nephilim. It appears to me to be more of a connection with just an angel who happens to be watching what's going on and relating that information to Daniel. The other mention of the Watchers is in the book of Enoch. multiple books of Enoch, but primarily Enoch 1. That book is a very controversial book, not just because it makes predictions about the arrival of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ, according to Christian religion, but it also talks about heaven in a way that no other Israelite scholar ever talks about. He talks about the Watchers and the fall of the Nephilim and other details that are, to this day, very controversial among biblical scholars. So it's been kind of shunned. In fact, it was only in the late 1800s that we actually got a copy of Enoch that we could read ourselves in the original text. With that being said, it's possible that what these ancient texts are talking about is a much earlier time when beings were making megalithic stonework. In Central and South America, it's considered pre-Inca stonework, where they were making walls and constructs of stones that weighed 30, 50, 100 tons and placing them so close together that you can't get a knife between them. There's very little evidence that this can be done by Stone Age tools. Not only that, but there's just the immense distances between the locations where these stones are erected and the quarries suggest that they weren't just putting them together with higher technology, they were transporting them with higher technology as well. The trilithons that I mentioned in Lebanon, there's no way for us today to move a 1,000-ton block of stone 3 miles or a mile from the quarry. We just can't do it. I mean, we could do it if it was at the dock where we have these massive cranes unloading container ships, but you can't move that crane to move that block of stone. That crane is in place and it's not going to move no matter what you do. There are other locations where these same kind of massive blocks of stone are emplaced almost as if they were children's blocks, as if they were saying, look what we can do. This was what our technology did.
That's a good place for us to, but can we just let Danielle jump in on that real quick? Dave?
I was going to turn it over to Danielle because I know she's got some ideas about the cataclysm during that time period.
Okay, Danielle, what do you think the Watchers are, and are they still with us?
I'm not hearing Danielle.
Danielle, you still with us? Oh, it looks frozen, huh?
I can't see her.
Her image is frozen, so I'm not sure if she's having a technical difficulty. Maybe the Watchers don't want her talking about it.
I was just going to say that.
All right, so if she gets back in, we'll let her jump in. So in the meantime, we'll kind of let you continue. I think where you just left off is that there's evidence of possibly technology that had to have been used to make some of these stone structures. Would have been what, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and go ahead.
So there are a number of really good modern day researchers. I tip my hat as just one example to Brian Forrester, who has explored these sites in Central and South America, as well as in Egypt and other locations, who points out how there is undeniable proof that we have had advanced technology creating things like stone boxes that the overall weight would be around 70, 80, as much as 100 tons, where somebody had a pair of circular saws, 6 feet in diameter, cutting the side off of one of these blocks in order to use that side as the top of a sarcophagus. There's one example in the Cairo Museum in Egypt where you can see the circular saw marks of this machine with dual blades cutting along this block. And at some point it goes, and it breaks in and snaps off part of the stone. So they discard that block. That block of stone is now in the museum, and you can see it was a circular saw 6 feet in diameter with dual blades running simultaneously. Who the heck made that? And what kind of technology was that? And what kind of power source did they have? He's shown how there are core drills that were used in different places in Egypt that show a progression that is 10 times better than the best diamond tip drills we have right now. And this was not into limestone or soft stone. This was into granite, which is, one of the hardest stones we could work with. There's no way Stone Age men or people during the dynastic Egyptian time period could have been doing it. Not to mention there are a number of places where stones appear to have been melted by temperatures in excess of 3,000 degrees. There just seems to be now incontrovertible proof that there was a high level of technology back around the much earlier Inca and Egyptian time period. In fact, the Incas talk about how when they found some of these locations, like Machu Picchu or some of the sites in Cuzco, they told the Spanish, these were here before us, we inherited them. And Brian Forster does an excellent job of showing how there were the early megalithic stones, which were beautifully, perfectly placed together, despite how heavy they were, with perfectly smooth faces that almost looks like they were polished. And then later work where the Inca took some of the fallen stones and repositioned them. And then finally, in a third age, they put their own stones on top with much less care and much less ability to fit these stones in perfectly.
A question comes up, Dave, that always comes up with me when I hear about this particular, the way that this technology transfer, and I wonder how would the Watchers, in your minds, and I know this requires some speculation, but how would they actually transfer this technology? Did they physically come down and train people? Was there some other way that they were able to do it? You think of even in 2001, The Space Odyssey, where the famous scene where the obelisk appears. And in this movie, the obelisk appears, and then I think it doesn't really show, but somehow that translates into the apes learning how to use weapons. But I believe in the book, or the story as it was written, I believe that they actually were showing images on the obelisk, and so the obelisk was kind of training the apes, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I read it. So do you have any ideas on that, on how these kind of technology transfers or how this training would take place?
Sure do. I would go first to one of yours and my favorite books, Fingerprint of the Gods, where he talks about this guy named Viracocha, which actually means the foam of the sea. And I'll get to why it's called that later on. And he says that when the Spanish came and the chroniclers were writing down what the Incas said they had experienced, they said this: working great miracles by his words, he came to the district of the Canas there, near a village called Cacha. The people rose up against him and threatened to stone him. They saw him sink to his knees and raise his hands to heaven, as if beseeching aid in the peril which beset him. The Indians declared that thereupon they saw fire in the sky, which seemed all around them. Full of fear, they approached him, meaning Viracocha, whom they had intended to kill, and besought him to forgive them. Presently, they saw that the fire was extinguished at his command, though stones were consumed by fire in such ways that large blocks could be lifted by hand as if they were cork. They narrate further that leaving the place where this occurred, he came to the coast, and there, holding his mantle, he went forth amidst the waves and was seen no more. And of the events, they gave him the name Viracocha, which means foam of the sea. So they're talking about this guy who, if you read further into this, he wasn't actually alone. He had other companions with him, the followers of Viracocha, who he instructed them to, not fight among themselves, not have human sacrifice. He taught them how to build things, how to irrigate land, how it says that he turned valleys into mountains and mountains into valleys, that he made water spring forth from walls, which sounds a lot like some of the pre-Inca stonework where they channeled water specifically so that it would come out almost like a faucet into, irrigation channels and other places that were more decorative than actually needed for agriculture. This story of Viracocha talks about a bearded white man who came in out of the ocean and then returned to the ocean. This same or similar bearded white figures appear in other legends like Thoth in Egypt, who taught the Egyptians before the first dynasty all about their gods. Thoth wasn't actually a god himself, although he was considered one later on. He was considered the messenger or the scribe of the gods. And he was a bearded white guy that came up out of the water. And before them, there was Oannes, who was a bearded white guy who came up out of the water in Sumeria, who, interestingly enough, is carved as having a fish suit with a hood or a mantle of some sort pushed over his head and what looks like a tail down by his feet. We're not really sure why they always seem to come up out of the water. We're not sure why they're bearded white men, but we see other carvings and instances of these bearded white men across the world.
So it was kind of like the Watchers version of Peace Corps, right?
Sure, absolutely.
But about a question I would have on that though is like, do you think that these particular Watchers, were they aliens that took human form, or was that their actual form, or was that just something we can't really ever know about?
There is some evidence that there is an ability for modern day non-human intelligences, they call them NHIs, to assume whatever form they want us to see and to disappear, not fly away, but just vanish whenever they want to no longer be seen by us. There's plenty of evidence that suggests, and this is one of the events I witnessed firsthand, that suggests that whatever they want us to see, we will see. So it's possible, and we can't rule it out, that they're showing us a human form because that's what they want us to see. However, that being said, there is a lot of evidence that suggests these are mortal creatures who can't react or interact with normal humans because we're disease-carrying pestilence balls on 2 feet. There's the story when Moses goes up onto the mountaintop to meet with Yahweh. Yahweh comes down in a physical form with smoke and fire and lightning, shaking the ground, terrifying the Israelites. And that before Moses can go up and meet with him, he has to go through these ritual cleansing baths, which include purification with burning incense, which may have been used to somewhat clean him of whatever parasites might be on his body. It's also seen in a similar way in Sumeria, where they built ziggurats so that only the high priest could be allowed to climb to the top of this ziggurat and meet with the gods. It almost seems like a bottleneck of sorts where they're trying to protect themselves from the natural diseases that we humans would carry. That suggests they're mortal and not immortal gods.
Yeah, interesting. So now, in your opinion, do you think it's more likely that these Watchers would be from another dimension or from another world within the same reality that we're in?
It's possible. I don't know if it's any more likely or unlikely that they're not just physical travelers. It's interesting to note that they often show off their travel skills. There's one very famous UFO event that happened in Stevensville, Texas, where a UFO described as being the size of a super Walmart with flat sides was displaying glyphs, illuminated glyphs on the side of its ship, trying to communicate to the humans. If they were extra dimensionals, they'd have just popped in and they would have just popped out when they wanted to. And it wasn't until a pair of F-16s on afterburner were sent up to find this thing that it took off, but it took off in a physical manner. It took off in a straight line, and just to show off what they could do, flew straight over the George W. Bush Western Ranch, known as the Western White House at the time, in Texas. If they were extra dimensional, they just have popped over. They would have just popped out. There's a famous, I believe it was an F-16 radar reporting of a triangular UFO in Belgium, back when the triangular UFO wave was happening in that country, where this thing was spotted at around 5,000 feet, just puttering along at 100 and something miles an hour. Again, a couple of fighters were vectored in with orders to possibly shoot at this thing because it was hovering over a nuclear weapons storage facility. And it went from 5,000 feet and then like zoomed down to 1,000 feet and seemed to like almost bounce off a lower level and then disappeared off the radar and then appeared 100 miles away, still puttering along at 100 miles an hour. So we can see them on radar. They seem to interact with our physical craft, where they turn them off and turn them on to make them not bother them, to get out of the way so they can do whatever it is they want to do. So it seems more likely to me that they're physical, even though they may be from a different dimension and are using their ships to travel dimension.
Right, right. So so a craft could be both physical and from another dimension. So when I say it's from another dimension, it's not implying that they're spiritual. They just me, or if we see the world in our known 4 dimensions. If there was a 5th dimension or a 6th dimension that they were operating in, we might only be able to partially perceive it, or perceive it when they were in a certain form, or when they wanted us to perceive it.
Right.
But I actually I want to change the format that I had going here, because we're going to go back to this Watcher thing, but I wanted to go into your personal story, which I read about, of the encounter, because I think it actually might relate to some of the other questions that we've been talking about here with the Watchers, and in terms of how they actually what their encounters with, for instance, what kind of form that their encounters with the ancients might be. So I want to just take an interlude for us to just go over your personal story. This is the one, I know you maybe have more than one. This is the one that you experienced with your kids.
Okay.
If you don't mind telling us that one, because that was interesting, and I think it could possibly have some bearing on this other stuff that we're discussing here.
Sure. Let me take a moment here and find out, can you get back to Danielle?
I don't know how to get back to, I don't have any way of contacting her. Let me pause this for a second. Okay, so we have Danielle back. There were technical difficulties on her end, or someone doesn't want us to know her story. But in any case, we're about to hear the personal story of a UFO encounter. First Dave's story, and then Danielle's. And one of the reasons it is interesting about this, at least I know of Dave's story because I've read it, is that it could actually have bearing on exactly what it is, or let's give a hint of what it is that they want and how it is that they tend to interact with us. So Dave, go ahead. Why don't you tell us the experience that you had with your family?
Okay. We used to live in a very rural area of Indiana, surrounded by cornfields, 7 or 8 miles away from the nearest city. The first encounter we had was my son and I looking at the night sky around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And I was pointing out, there's Jupiter, that's an airplane. And then this orange ball, about half the size of the full moon, appears on the horizon, not moving, just sitting. And I said, this is what they call an orb. And we couldn't tell how big it was, how far away it was. I was going to light a bonfire. I told my son, keep your eyes on it, don't take your eyes off it, because they have this nasty habit of disappearing as soon as you stop looking at it. So he's watching it, and probably we've been watching it for about a minute or so. And he looks away to the bonfire and looks back, and it's gone. Just that fast. It could not have been a helicopter, couldn't have been an airplane. It had the color of a sodium vapor lamp. It was very bright, it was very intense. Nothing like any of the stars or planets in the sky. About a year later, in the spring, I was working at my desk overlooking the fields facing east, and suddenly there were 2 brilliant magnesium-like white lights, what appeared to be at the end of our driveway, about 200 feet from the road. And I called out to my kids. So my 2 daughters were there too. And I said, look out the front window. You can see this, right? And they're like, yeah, we see it. So I said, don't take your eyes on it. Keep your eyes on it. I'm going to come into where you are. So I came into there, and they're like, they could see this thing. It looked like landing lights for a 747. I used to live near O'Hare, so I know what those looked like. They were massive. They were bigger than the full moon. They were just hanging there. There's no way this was a reflection. This couldn't have been a drone. This couldn't have been airplanes or anything like that. And it wasn't anything that's an artifact from the cities, because we're just too far away. And I said, okay, I'm going to go in the front room. You keep watching it, and I'll watch it when I get to the front room. So I go in the front room. They follow in. We're still watching this. I tell them, keep their eyes on it. I'm going to go outside. So I went out our front door, and within 15 feet of our front door is a massive 10-foot wide maple tree. And between the point where I went from one side of the maple tree to the other side of the maple tree, they blipped out. They're just gone. And I was so mad. I was so angry and frustrated that I actually stormed down to the end of the driveway and started screaming up at the sky. I know you're there. You know I know you're there. Show yourselves. What are you, scared? And one of my daughters had to come out and say, Dad, calm down, calm down. But they have that ability to, when we take our eyes off them, disappear. There's a famous story of a police officer in England who spotted 3 very tall, suspiciously thin humanoids in what appeared to be white jumpsuits investigating a crop circle. And he went out there to try to scare them away or arrest them. And they seemed to ignore him until he put his foot in the crop circle. And then they all 3 turned to look at him at the exact same time. And then they started running away, he described, as if it was deer leaping in slow motion. And he's chasing them and yelling at them. And he looks down, to make sure he doesn't trip, and looks back, and they're gone. And this seems to happen repeatedly. If they want us to see them, or if they're not aware that we're seeing them, we can. But when we take our eyes off of them, they can become invisible just that fast.
Yeah, that's the interesting part about your story, the idea that they not only want to be seen, and there are different ways to interpret that, because you can look at that and say, all right, they're trying to show off and they want to be seen. But you can look at it too. Is there some kind of a cognitive experience going on here? I can't really imagine that there are a bunch of aliens sitting in a craft, blinking lights, hoping that you will see them. It suggests to me that there's something a little deeper going on, where whether you've drawn those lights to you, and that's why they're appearing. Is there a level of communication going on there? Is there some kind of communication that's going on that gets interrupted when you turn away? I mean, is it possible they're downloading some kind of information into you? I mean, it's all kinds of crazy possibilities, but it's just hard to imagine a bunch of guys in a ship, little green men in a ship that pop up and they just want to be seen. And as soon as they're not seen, it does suggest there's something more involved and difficult to understand going on there, which leads me to wonder if similar interaction happened in the past, with primitive men or early civilizations, what kind of impact that might have. Danielle, what were your stories? And I know you have some thoughts on that, because Danielle's website, watch.sightings.live. So not only does she have her own experience, but she has all the other experience that people can post there, and anybody can go on there and post their video or their encounter. Are you seeing a similar type of evidence to what Dave is seeing, where if you turn away, the UFOs disappear?
Yeah, I guess I'd say it's like that for a lot of people. I have an experience like that as well. I remember it was early in the morning, and I went outside to play with my dogs, first thing I do, and I look up at the sky, and there's clouds on one side, clouds on the other. In the middle, there's a triangle outline. Nothing in the triangle, just an outline, a cloudy outline of a triangle. And I'm like, this is the coolest thing. I'm gonna get my phone and take a picture of it. I run inside, I get my phone, it's gone. There's no way a cloud could disappear in the 6 seconds it took me to get my phone.
Yeah.
So
was it an exact triangle?
It was exact, it had points and everything.
Because I don't believe there are triangles in nature, probably.
I think that you can get triangles in nature if it's like, if you get the right kind of wind flowing. But since there were no other clouds near it, that's really weird for me.
Yeah.
But that's just to answer to your question, like, do things disappear when you stop looking at them? I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just a triangle-shaped cloud formed by the wind. But the encounter that I wanted to talk about was one about lights in the sky. Those are the most common, right? I like to take walks in the evening just to look at the sky and see if there's maybe something interesting there. And one evening I was out looking, and suddenly I saw this red light blink in, blink out, blink in, blink out. And I'm looking at it like, okay, it's gonna show up at the next spot. And it doesn't show up there, it shows up underneath somewhere else. And I'm like, wait, did that just jump? It's supposed to go in a line, right? And then I realized this is really bright. This isn't a satellite, because I'm out there every night just looking at satellites, looking at planes. It's too close to be a satellite, and it doesn't have the right kind of lights for a plane. What is it? And it was just a curiosity, something that I saw, something that was really cool, and I forgot about for a couple of days, until maybe 3 days later. I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna go to MoveOn and see if, for no reason. And right there on the front page of MoveOn is a man asking, I saw these red lights just jump across the sky. Did anyone else see this, please? And so I'm like, wait, this is interesting. This wasn't just a curiosity. And so I replied to him and I told him what I saw. And he had seen it by the Great Lakes. And I'd seen it, of course, from the coast of South America. And we'd seen it a few days apart. And we promised to keep in touch, but we never did. I don't know if COVID got him or something. Hope not. But so that's my story. And
well, and I'm also curious too, where looking at the approach you're taking on your website, where you're trying to build this very large database of primarily current data from people's experiences. So could you put in any way a number on the number of experiences that, similar to Dave's, where the object or whatever it is you're seeing disappears or seems to, or at least breaks contact when you're not observing it? So at least there's some kind of a connection between your observing it and its ability to appear. Are you seeing, could you put a number on that, or?
I can't put a number on that. We don't have that many cases, and of the cases reported, people are mostly sent in pictures of things they thought they were strange, but they didn't say in their story that the thing disappeared when they weren't looking at it or anything like that. So that's still kind of anecdotal that happens.
Dave, have you heard any numbers on that, or any kind of a yardstick we could use?
Not exactly, but there is one really interesting story that is somewhat well known. The author John Keel, who wrote the Mothman Prophecies, when he first started working on that, he didn't really have much of a handle on the paranormal, but he knew of a fellow named Ivan T. Sanderson, who was an early writer of things about, you know, the unusual, the paranormal. He coined the term ultra-terrestrial as opposed to extraterrestrial, because he was one of the first proponents of the idea that these came from another dimension. Well, he and John and their two wives were at Ivan T. Sanderson's place, which I believe was northwest, not far away from Point Pleasant, which is where the Mothman sightings happened in the 60s. And John and Ivan saw what they believed was a silvery disc-shaped UFO come out of the sky and flash down and then stop and then start moving along well to the ground. And they turned to their wives like, did you see that? Can you see that UFO? And for whatever reason, the wives couldn't see it. And they're like, it's right there. It's right. It's like it's right there. It was as clear as an airplane. And as they're watching it, it starts to kind of shift and morph, and it turns into what looks like a Cessna. And one of the wives said, you mean by the Cessna? And they're like, it is the Cessna. That's it. That's the UFO. And it appears, at least to Ivan Sanderson and John Keel, that a disc-shaped UFO morphed into what looks like a traditional airplane. And that's a somewhat interesting story. If true, if accurate, then it suggests they can pretty much show us whatever they want us to see.
This is why this particular stuff is fascinating to me, because the idea of what human beings are conscious of and what human consciousness is, and how it relates to these kind of phenomena. If you had an alien that had a completely different type of consciousness that we do, similar to, say, the difference between our consciousness and a dog, how would they communicate with us, and how would we perceive it on our end? But so, for instance, I mentioned I wanted to talk about the cognitive revolution. So about I was reading a book by Yuval Noah Harari. It's called Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind. And this is a purely scientific book. There's nothing about alien technology or anything in it. But one of the interesting things scientists have found that 70,000 years ago, there was humans started to undergo what they call a cognitive revolution. And for the first time, they started thinking differently about the world and communicating differently about the world. For instance, for 2 million years, Homo erectus was using tools, but the tool knowledge didn't advance at all. The tool knowledge that they were using at the beginning was the same type of tools that they were using 2 million years later. And then when Homo sapiens appeared, which was around 300,000 years ago, according to the latest official evidence, for 230,000 years, it was the same thing. They pretty much used the same tools, and they weren't passing on any significant culture or knowledge. They were only able to organize in small groups, just like chimpanzees today do. So groups of 50 or 75, at the most 150. But around 70,000 years ago, human beings developed something very new. And what he talks about in his book is, for the first time, human beings started using fiction. So, for example, a Neanderthal could communicate to its other Neanderthals that there's a lion down at the watering hole, don't go down there. But that was the limit of what they could communicate. And that was the limit of what humans could communicate for the first 200 and plus thousand years of Homo sapiens. But suddenly, around 70,000 years ago, they began to communicate fictions. So now they could, for instance, say there's a monster down at the watering hole. And this became critical to our development, because now you could create the kind of fictions on which the basis of civilization is built. You have kingdoms, you have religion, you have gods, you have myths. These are all the things that communication-wise can bound larger groups together. But scientists still have no idea, did something change in the brain 70,000 years ago, the way it was wired? Because it was very sudden that this all came on. So I'm curious, if you have any thoughts on that, because I'm looking at I think of your encounter with the UFO, and I still can't help seeing that opening scene from 2001: Space Odyssey, where all of a sudden this obelisk shows up, and it seems to change the way the early the early humans thought or approached things. I don't know. Do you have any ideas on that, Dave?
I do, but I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation, and we should maybe give a little bit more time to Danielle.
Sure,
I haven't heard her explanation of what she thinks about the Watchers and the Nephilim and their connection, and whether they're still with us.
Okay, so the way I see it, if we look at the ancient megalithic structures that we have and the structures that were built on top of those, we've got multiple civilizations here, right? And I'm thinking that these remnants are the result of at least 2 cataclysmic events. So the first one, maybe there was an advanced civilization already, and this cataclysmic event came and completely erased that. But it was so advanced that people could predict the cataclysm coming, so they started preparing, building bunkers, trying to survive. Some of them who would have had the means to do so might have left. And when the cataclysm came, it would have destroyed most of the world, would have destroyed most of those bunkers, and a few might have survived. And the survivors of that cataclysm would have come out, would have seen an absolutely devastated world, and the only technology that would be left would be whatever they had with them in the mega bunkers. So they would come out, they would reboot society, and they'd have a renaissance of all that advanced technology and have a great time, high buildings, everything. But because there were so few of them, you wouldn't be able to gain all of the knowledge, right? You wouldn't have enough teachers and you wouldn't have enough students. So some knowledge would be lost, and you'd get a civilization that was partly advanced and partly really simple, and that would then grow. And there'd be a lot of people, with a few people being like super advanced and most people being pretty regular. And you'd have the lords and the regular folk. And the lords would have the mega machines that could do stuff, and they'd be very important people, and the regular folk would work for them. And then a second cataclysm came, and that would again destroy everything. And the remaining bunkers would be the ruins we see today, like the ball-back-sized stones, right? That would have been the last ruins of the remaining bunkers, absolutely destroyed. And the survivors of that would be the people starting from scratch today, our civilization. We then start writing history. We find these old ancient sites, these old megalithic sites, and we build on top of them, and we try to figure out what happened. And I think that basically the Watchers, the sky people, those might be the people coming back, the people who had evacuated from the cataclysm coming back, they would be the sky people. And we now think of the people who remained, who were the lords and who are the sky people, as gods, as people who had amazing powers. But that's because the stories were told by the primitive people who lived among them, who didn't have the right kind of education to understand where these advanced people got their technology from. So that's my basic idea about that. And
well, a question I would have on that, Danielle, is, so I know that so Hancock in Fingerprints of the Gods, one of the things that he was suggesting was that these megaliths, where humans were carving and moving stones, that seemed impossible they could have had the technology. The purpose of these megaliths was to kind of leave an encoded message as a warning to us that these kind of disasters are going to happen, and so that we would be prepared for it. Do you think that that's the purpose of the megaliths, or is it the bunkers, or a little bit of both? Or
I think it might be a little bit of both. Mostly that they were bunkers, mostly that these people built things for themselves and that they carved into it like, okay, warning for the future generations, pay attention to this. But I think people have always been practical and mostly built things to protect themselves and their loved ones. So I think that those were actually used structures. And this is all speculation. We don't know, right. But trying to fit it together, I like my speculation better than the official explanation.
Do you think that the aliens, the Watchers, however we want to call them, had the ability to protect us from these disasters, and they chose not to, or they didn't, or that was just something that was beyond even their power? Or is it even possible that they themselves unleashed these on us, kind of like, say, God unleashing the flood in order to rid the earth of the Nephilim?
Right. So we don't know if they unleashed it on us or if it was natural, but we do know that even today, we can build an atomic bomb, but once it's been set in motion, we can't stop it anymore. So I think it was something like that, where even if they caused it, once it was set in motion, they could not stop it. Not even the megalithic bunkers could survive this thing.
And do you think maybe there are different types of Watchers or different factions of Watchers, kind of like we have different nations and are doing various different things with their nuclear weapons and their different technology? So when you talk about the Watchers, is there one Watchers that kind of is in control, or could they even be warring amongst each other or competing amongst each other?
Yeah, I think diversity always wins, right? So when you're on a little island and you don't know what's out there, everybody is called the outsider. But the outsider isn't one group of people. It's so many different, it's 200 different countries and Antarctica.
So in theory, one faction of Watchers could be protecting us from another faction of Watchers that is actually not trying to help us, or is either trying to exploit us, or even worse.
Yeah, for sure. You might have the equivalent of the people who go and save seals from oil spills, coming over here, trying to protect us from anyone trying to take advantage, those good souls. And you could just have people trying to reap humans. It could be very interesting. And I'm glad that this is a show where we can just have fun with speculation and nobody's going to get offended, because we have absolutely no idea what's going on.
Right.
It's still nice to think about it. And
it's fun to think about, right?
Mind about all of the possibilities that we exclude by default for no reason. Just let your mind wander. It's possible that there's so many different groups of people just visiting. You go on a hike through the park. You see a little fox with a little jar over his head, and you pull the jar off. And the fox goes off and tells his friends, "The others saved me." But you're just one person. It's not like all of humanity likes foxes, you know.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to circle back on the cognitive revolution? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, that is still a very hot topic right now with science. It's a big mystery as to what caused it, whether our brains were wired different at that time. It seems to be kind of sudden, but...
Right. Well, you know, if we're looking at things that are 70,000 years old, 1,000 years might seem sudden to us, but would seem like 1,000 years to us if we lived there. There has been some back and forth about whether or not this massive explosion with Mount Toba at 75,000 BC had some effect on this equally controversial theory about a bottleneck in humanity, where somewhere around that same time period, circa 70,000 BC, there may have been as few as 10,000 breeding pairs of humans, and according to one theory, as little as 40 breeding pairs of humans. They get that number from the lack of genetic diversity from humans at that time period. But there has been some pushback on that theory because there doesn't appear to be incontrovertible proof that this Toba eruption, which would have affected the world, had any effect on, for example, stone-making tools of the humans from prior to and post that explosion. We know that there was an explosion of in 1815 of Mount Tambora, which in the following year created the summer, or the year without a summer, where they had 6-foot snowdrifts in June and July across parts of North America and Europe. And that was much, much smaller than this Mount Toba eruption in 75,000 BC. So it's quite possible that there was a bottleneck that caused humans to almost go extinct, the Mount Toba extinction hypothesis. There was another bottleneck that happened around 1.2 million years ago, where there may have been as few as 25,000 humans that we all descended from. However, there's a competing theory that this may not be an example of us almost dying out, as much as it's the point where we started spreading out from Africa. And the people that spread out from Africa into Europe and Asia and Australia, and then from there into North America, by spreading out into these new regions, we're able to diversify and have more genetic changes. And that explains why from that point on, there's such a spread of biodiversity among, Homo sapiens. So it's not really clear if that actually happened, if there really was a bottleneck, or if we're looking at it without seeing exactly what caused it. I did actually want to talk about how you were talking about this possible cataclysm that may be connected to the Lesser Dryas event around 10,000 BC. There is a lot of evidence now that there was some kind of interruption of the builders, which is what I call it. I'm not sure I want to use the term the Watchers of the Nephilim because they have such a direct connotation to the Old Testament, which, as I mentioned before, has possibly been so far removed from the actual events that those stories are based on. I prefer to think of them just as the builders, because they seem to have, if they've left anything behind, they've left these megalithic structures behind, these massive ones that don't appear to have been buildable by people using Stone Age technology circa 10,000 BC. But there are a number of sites worldwide where it seems like these builders had just stopped, like they took a lunch break and never came back. There is a place called the Serapeum in Egypt, where there are these massive 100-ton blocks that appear to have been carved out into huge empty sarcophagi underneath the ground, like in the bedrock. And in this hallway, there's one of these blocks that's just left there. It never made it into the niche where they were putting the other ones. And the top of it is a little further ahead in the same passageway. They just stopped. There's a block not far from a place in South America called Ollantaytambo. Ollantaytambo is this beautiful collection of big, huge, massive stones on the top of a ledge, thousands of feet up the side of this hill from a quarry that's, a couple of miles away, down a river valley, up another mountain on the other side. Right in the middle is this massive block of stone, 80 tons or more, that's just lying there like somebody dropped it and forgot to come back for it. And there are a number of other sites where it seems like the builders stopped working all of a sudden and never came back. At Baalbek, the largest of the stones was never taken out of the ground. It's called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. This thing's 1,100 tons, and they just stopped. It's not like they couldn't move it, because they moved the 3 other ones that weighed 1,000 tons that they put in place at Baalbek. But for whatever reason, that 4th one never got finished. There are other places
like here for a second.
Sure.
I'd like to jump in here for a second about all these examples that you're giving. And I just want to say, well, this ties into my idea that people knew a cataclysm was coming, and everybody in their own way was trying to build defenses against it right up until the last moment that it was coming. And they either had to hide or leave. It was done. This is as far as we get, and just let the chips fall where they may. And now we find these remnants of these very large stones, the only ones that were so big that they couldn't be washed away. So that's my speculation about why those stones are just left there half finished.
Right.
I'm glad you brought up the builders, Dave, because that was next on my list. And but a question that I have on this, and I'll go to Danielle with it first. Actually, based on what you just said, so the early humans that became aware of the impending disaster, how did they become aware of it? Was it some technology that they had on their own, or were they given this message by the Watchers or somebody that was trying to watch out for them? How do you think that, or is that? I know that's just speculation, but what do you think on that?
Well, there's some stories in which, especially the old Sumerian stories, that the advanced people, they get this knowledge through their technology, and they go and they tell select humans that something is going to happen and to prepare. So in many of the stories, that's how it goes, and that's fine by me. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine how that communication takes place. Again, back to 2001 Space Odyssey, the obelisk appears. That's more subtle, but or does somebody actually appear to someone in a dream, or and speaks their language, or does someone give them some kind of a technology for which they're able to use to see? For instance, there was a lot of talk in Fingerprints of the Gods about the precession movements of the planet, and how I forget what it was, 26,000 years, the planet would be aligned in a way that would make it more vulnerable to something that could lead to a natural disaster. Dave, you probably know a lot more about that than certainly I do.
Well, there's a lot of discussion about the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. We've still only barely scratched the surface of what is still buried, not just there, but at some of the other sister sites in Turkey. The most well-studied pillar is one known as Pillar 43, where they have these carvings of birds and other creatures, including a scorpion, that they believe compare to astronomical alignments in the sky. And one of the birds, a giant condor type creature, has his wing out and holds a disc, a globe, on his wing, which suggests that this is where the sun was in this constellation when this pillar was erected. Or there was an event that happened when the sun was in this constellation, and they may be saying this is when this catastrophe occurred. There's also at the bottom of this pillar a headless human, which kind of suggests something bad happened to the humans. It's possible that these pillars were erected to remind people of what happened, and they were instructed, don't forget, because this may happen again, remember these stories. But the problem is, when these are erected somewhere around 9,000 BC or so, this may be long after the event. We used to think originally that these circles, and there's multiples, there's hundreds of them, were erected at the same time as this cataclysmic event, around 10,000 BC or so. Now it seems like they're saying, no, they're later than that. We do know, however, that some sites like Stonehenge had an earlier construction period where they didn't work with stone, they worked with wood. They had these massive wood henges. In fact, we can still see some wood henges around England that were, for example, one of them on the south coast was covered up by the ocean. And they're now seeing that this wood henge actually existed. There's another one not far from Stonehenge, where it's possible that if Stonehenge went through at least 3 different construction phases over more than 1,000 years, it's possible that the Göbekli Tepe circles with their T-shaped pillars, at least in my estimation, could have gone through a similar building phase and change of building material over 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
You were also mentioning before about whether or not there are good watchers and bad watchers, and there's a lot of back and forth these days about, are there good aliens?
Let me just say something real quick about Göbekli Tepe before you go into that.
Right.
One of the things I want to point out about Göbekli Tepe is it's a pretty advanced structure for its time. I mean, it's pretty difficult to build that, but at the same time, it's also kind of crude looking. So you would think that it was built exactly by a civilization that was partly advanced and partly primitive. So this is one of those things that goes into that. Unless the artist in charge really had that kind of style, I would think that it was built with some kind of advanced technology, and yet also partly primitive technology to make the drawings like that, the carvings like that. So that's just what I wanted to say before you go on.
Right. What's really interesting with those is that most societies after that point, Sumeria, Egypt, China, Japan, any place where they've got carved stone, would do the simplest method of carving, which is usually carving into the stone. But Göbekli Tepe's T-shaped pillars are not that at all. They actually carve the stone away to release, as it were, a 3D relief of birds and reptiles and things like that. So they did it the hardest way, which is kind of surprising, because that doesn't seem like that's an early technique. That seems like that's a later technique. So I kind of agree with you. Yeah, it does seem both primitive and advanced at the same time.
Exactly.
A question that I have, and then if you want, we'll move on to the challenge. But so you can take but we're in no rush here, so you can take as much as you want to answer this. But this is kind of a key question, I think. So we're talking about watchers, and I think you both seem in agreement that there is an alien civilization or presence that is, at least part of it, is looking out for us and guiding us and perhaps moving us along a little further with its technology, certainly back at the time of this megalithic building. So the big question is where are they? Have they continued doing this? You know, where else have they jumped in and helped us in our civilization? Did they stop? Did they help us out 6,000 years ago and then say, okay, now you're on your own? And, you know, are they still here? Are they still trying to influence any of the technology that we're developing? Have they influenced any of the technology that we have developed? Certainly, we've had an explosion in technology over the last couple hundred years. Is it your idea or belief that maybe they played a part in this? So I'll let Daniel go first.
I'm not convinced that the same people we had in the time that the Bible stories are about are the same people we've got now, because the whole approach is different, isn't it? In those days, the powerful ones were kind of jealous and fighting with each other and wanting to control everyone. And now people are reporting, well, yeah, I met them and they cured my toothache. It's like, it's not the same group of people, you know? So the planet may have switched ownership at some point. I don't know.
Or it could be that they're reacting to us being different. We're much more advanced. We're much more dangerous. We're much more warlike. I mean, back in the old days, like I was reading from Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, where they were going to stone to death Viracocha. And he raised his hands up and brought fire down from the heavens. And they were like, okay, we'll back off. Whereas if that happened today, our militaries would go, I want that. Can we talk to you about taking that technology and putting it on our own vehicles? That's a different, kind of interaction that they're going to have with us now because of who we are and what our technology is right now.
So you don't think that they're, or maybe you do. Do you think they're trying to influence us in any way now?
I think it would. I think it's clear that we are being observed by more than one type of observer. I don't know if I want to call them the Watchers. I don't know if I even want to call them aliens. They could be from the future. You know, there's been some very strange occurrences that seem to be almost like they're seeding, modern humanity with technology by intentionally crashing it onto the earth, and then we pick up the pieces and build, something new out of it. I can't rule out that possibility that they're not from the future. Again, I can't also say
in a minute when you're done. But I want to say the opposite in a minute when you're done.
The one thing that I think was really interesting that we haven't got probably any time to track on today is when you look at the ancient megalithic structures around the world, there is one key element that seems to connect all of them together, and that's something that people call the immortal chins or the immortal knobs. And they are these little, sometimes as small as about the size of a shoe, rectangular protrusions from the stones that were being put in place at that time. The earliest ones at a site called Sacsayhuaman in Cusco didn't have protrusions. They had rectangular recesses into the stone. Usually these are at the bottom of the stones, and it looks like somebody just scooped out a little rectangular depression into the stone. These stones are the ones that appear to have had a natural stone facing that had eroded away over eons from a nearby hill, and they'd carved them out of the hill and put them in place, and then almost like a signature, cut away a little bit of the stone as if to say there were three of us that did this. There's three depressions carved into the stone. There's a couple of stones where they have multiple rectangular depressions carved into the stone. But again, that seems to have a natural surface to it. It's only when you go into the later stones that are in place, which have a smoothed face, that you see these protrusions from. And it took me about 6 months back in 2016 where I just kept hammering away at this idea. Why are these chins here? Why are these protuberances here? That it finally dawned on me that what they're doing is they're showing how much of the stone they carved away. And that protuberance shows you the original outside edge of the stone when they brought it into position, and then they carved away what they wanted to make it flat. If you look at Menkare's pyramid, the third pyramid at Giza, you can see the facing of pink granite, but they left all of the stones faces to be natural, including a number of them with these protuberances. And only around the entrance did they smooth the faces flat. And it looks like they took some tool and carved it flat straight down the face of the mountain, face down the face of the pyramid, because you can see curved marks of the stone where it's been smoothed away, and they left the natural part behind on the same stone. So what they're showing is we can put these in place, we can leave these stones the way they are, and then we can cut away as much stone as we want from a stone that's already in place. We see these as old as the stone structure called the Osirion, which is below ground level and was thought to have been possibly one of the graves of Osiris because of his connection with the land of the dead below ground. There are little stone knobs on these massive stone features in China and in Japan, where they have, they're huge. We see the same kind of stone protuberances at Sacsayhuaman, but at Sacsayhuaman, some of them are perfectly flat rectangles that go for 15, 20 feet. These cannot have been used to move the stones because obviously most of the stones don't have those protuberances. What I think is interesting is at Sacsayhuaman, up behind the zigzag row that we normally think of with that site, the mountaintop has a phenomenal layout of places where people were using this same technology almost as if they were practicing with the tools. They carve stairways to nowhere, they carve seats next to seats within seats, they have flat areas, they have curved areas. It's almost as if they're testing out the technology. And my theory is that whoever the builders were at least at this one site. They were taking the humans and saying, here's the technology, practice with it, show me what you can do, and if you're good enough, we'll let you help put in some of the big stones up in front. And the ones that they were allowed to help with, those are the ones that have a knob there, because that's their way of signifying, like a signature, like an autograph, I helped put this in place. It's also interesting that a number of other sites have places where there are clear signs of scorching, of dangerous misapplication of heat sources. In a city called Tanis in northern Egypt, the place looks like it was hit by an atomic bomb. There are broken statues and pieces of stone everywhere. Pumapunku seems to have had something similar to that, although that might have been a massive tsunami from the nearby Lake Titicaca. And Ollantaytambo has the same kind of effect. It looks like something blew these stones apart, because there are these megalithic stones scattered all over the place, like somebody dumped out a giant set of building blocks. At Tanis, there's one statue, a massive granite statue, which looks like it has heat rays that would have come down from the sun at an angle, which kind of ties in with this story of Viracocha calling fire down from the sky. We don't know why these scorch marks only appear at places where there was human contact with these buildings. If this was, say, a plasma discharge by the sun, we'd see it in stones all over the place. We'd see it in the Rocky Mountains, in the Appalachians, and other places. We'd see it on the side of the pyramids. But we only see it in select specific locations where there was apparently some give and take between the builders and the humans. And it seems like it's localized enough that in one place in South America, it almost melts this entire series of 3 or 4 stones, and yet the stones on the outside of it and underneath it and above it are perfectly fine. One of my theories is that at some point, and we have to tie this in with the idea that if there were massive technological uses back at this time, like the 6-foot sized circular saws that were used to cut that one block that's now in the Cairo Museum, or whatever they used to make core drillings in Egypt and other drilling examples in South America, that technology has never been found. We haven't found so much as a spring or a screw or a battery from this time period. It seems like whoever was using this technology had enough time and ability to pick up all their tools and get the heck out of Dodge. It's possible that they didn't know what was coming. And if they didn't, their sudden departure might have upset the locals to a point where they tried to rebel, just like the story of Viracocha, having to defend himself from the people who were mad. And it's possible that some of the scorching marks might have come from a vehicle in the sky, or in some cases, it might have been the locals using the same technology that they used to cut the stones and turning them against their builder teachers because of their anger and frustration.
Danielle, do you have any? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Danielle, do you have any? I think the question was, are they still influencing us in the present or throughout history since over the last several thousand years? Do they appear periodically? Are they continuously kind of watching? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to say about the Tower of Babylon that we were, in that case, if you read the story, we were rebooting after the flood, and we had a great society going. We were pretty advanced. We built this tower, and the drawings don't do the tower justice. If you listen to the description of it, it's a place where everybody had their station, and it was a way to go to the stars. It was a Stargate. If we were able to rebuild that kind of advancement after the flood that quickly, we would have been a pretty scary civilization. And it's no wonder that those overseers would have said, destroy that tower. They're not coming over here. We have no control over them. And we had to start from scratch again. And it would seem to me that anybody who would flood us, then when we rebuild, destroy the rebuild, and then when we try to rebuild again, what are they going to do? Help us? No, I don't think so. I think that they might just be more interested in keeping us on a particular level. And if you listen to the stories of people who are being taken, they say, oh, I was taken and they helped me and my life is going to be super special now. But those people live pretty ordinary lives, and kind of makes you wonder if they're not taking people who would have made a tremendous innovation and just wiping their memories of those innovations. Like they can look like 10 minutes, like a few years into the future. Oh yeah, this one's gonna build the cannon, kidnap him, wipe. Now you're gonna be a clerk in a store, live a normal life in an office. And
Yeah.
I don't think that they're motivated to let us build advanced things anymore. They're motivated in letting us live a good enough life to be happy.
Oh, that's interesting. So, and they're trying to kind of apply the brakes to us a little bit.
Yeah, because we went, if you listen to academics, we went in 4,000 years from sticks and stones to landing 2 rockets side by side, fully autonomously. We don't need a lot of time to do stuff. So if there were anyone who had lost control of their experiment, they would be putting on the brakes, not putting gas. This is a chemical fire that burns by itself. That's how I describe humanity.
But
Yeah, it's always.
So if they were putting the brakes on us, wouldn't they have taken people like Tesla and Einstein and the fellow that invented TNT and Gatling, who invented the machine gun? Wouldn't they have taken those people, and wouldn't that have set us back much farther than we are right now?
No, because Tesla, in all of his brilliance, he wasn't able to make the world of wireless electricity. They destroyed his tower before he could make it happen. So they didn't have to interfere with him. And TNT, well, TNT was so destructive. It was used in every war since its discovery. It helps to divide and conquer. Nobody needs to stop the guy who invented TNT.
It does seem that if the universe or if our world was created by some futuristic or alien version of an engineer, a software programmer, or a kid with a science experiment, and if you think about programming a video game and you kind of want it to go a certain way, and every once in a while, if it seems to be coming off the rails from where you wanted it to go, you go in and tweak it. You give it a little juice here or put on the brakes there. Or that does seem to me a reasonable possibility. And even myself, while I tend to be an atheist, this idea that God or the creator has to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good has never really made sense to me. To me, either God, the creator, has created this universe and doesn't really care what happens to people in it, or he does care, he or she cares, however, is not all-powerful, not all-knowing. Just like if you did create your own computer game, that does not mean you would be all-powerful about what was going on inside it. So I think there's some possible validity to what Danielle is saying, where the Watchers, if they're there, if they're aliens, if there's a power that's out there that's watching over us, there may be times where they want to speed things up or apply the brakes in order to keep us kind of on a track that they either suits their purpose or they think is healthier for us. If that makes sense. I don't know. Does that make sense, Danielle?
Yeah, exactly. And to tie into what you said, that God does not sound all-knowing. Depends on which one you're listening to, right? The Buddhists describe a God that's like this one source of energy, that there's love everywhere, and there's really just one thing. And the Bible describes a God who demands 50 sheep and some chickens. And these are not the same two things. They're two different concepts. So there's this higher level of something that is all loving. And there's this other level where there are these very powerful people, much more powerful than the others around them, who are in charge of those people. And both things can be happening at the same time. We get confused when we give those two concepts the same name and say this all-powerful oneness wants 50 sheep. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
This Lord wants 50 sheep, and the all-powerful oneness wants to love us all. And they're two separate things. So I think translations of ancient texts are a big problem here, in that in translations, people equate texts with each other and change names to be the same name. And actually, I'd like to recommend a book from Paul Wallace called Escaping Eden, in which he talks about how translations have tripped us up in the past. And if you read older text and you stop the names together and calling everything God, the Bible is actually about many different groups having many different experiences. I think it's a wonderful book, and really it can only help you to read it. Escaping from Eden.
Thank you.
And I'd like to respond to a few things that Dave said. At one point he said that some of the stones looked as though it was student work. I agree with that. That, you know, you might have had a teacher saying, use this advanced technology and practice, and if you're good enough. There are some stones that have become holy sites that really did look like somebody carved here, okay, it's good. Somebody carved on the other side, no, you didn't pass. And later, future generations thought, this is where the powerful ones were, we're gonna have ceremonies here. So I agree with Dave on that. I don't know if you're ready to leave from this topic yet, though. So.
Well, we've been going almost an hour and a half. What I was thinking of doing is giving you my last challenge that comes out of Dave's really clever comments on Quora, and you guys would both have a chance to answer this. I'm going to call it the Noah challenge. So the question that Dave had responded to was this: you have 10 seconds to find a weapon. What did you find? So I'm going to just take parts of his answer, but he said, I'd relax for 9 of those seconds and then start typing on my laptop. With a computer, I can reach hundreds of millions of people worldwide, inform them of their actions they need to take, organize their efforts, and galvanize them into a coordinating force of resistance or support, depending on what needs of the moment. If all else fails, a computer with internet access can record my last words, along with the identity of any assailant, which I can live stream to the world or to my local police department. So I guess in one version of that scenario was he had an assailant that was about to get him. So which made me think, similar to this topic, what if you were given information from the Watchers or from some similar source that the world was going to end, or humanity's part in the world was going to end, similar to the biblical flood, was going to wipe out most of all the human race in 1 hour. So you've got 1 hour to type up your message, and we have a way that this message will make it thousands of years from now. Maybe we're going to send it out by satellite, and it's going to bounce back 5,000 years from now, and it'll reach whatever humanity has grown back into. So what would your message be to those humans from 5,000 years ago that have climbed back to whatever level they're at? Dave, you want to go first? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I guess I try to download the Internet Archive and get that gone. One day they'll be able to translate it and see everything.
That's cheating. You have to say it in your words.
With my 3 wishes, Jeannie, I would like to have 1,000,000 wishes. So are you saying we would have some way of transmitting this information so we don't have to worry about the transmission source? You just want to know what the message is?
Yeah, you're just compiling the message. You have a short time to compile it. It's your own words, and it's going to be sent out and bounce back up a neutron star that's going to bring it back here in 5,000 years or something like that.
I have 3 words. Okay? Try again, comma, again, period. Because that's what we are. We keep trying. We don't quit. Keep trying again and again. I think it's interesting that the only real evidence we have of these builders is not the text, is not the stories, because the stories get mistranslated. The stories get forgotten or evolved or lost or whatever. But what we really have of these lost builders is the stone, because the stone will survive hundreds of thousands of years. Some of these stone buildings, we don't know how old they are. They could be, according to Velikovsky, if you believe him, Pumapuku was sighted against a star alignment from 20,000 BC. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but some of these at least are 10,000 BC, because that's where Göbekli Tepe is. If we're going to build something, we want to show that there is a significant level of achievement humans can make if we work together. I think that's the message you have to give. The Tower of Babel was only completed because humans worked together. The pyramids and Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo and all these other things, I think are examples of the builders saying, work together. We'll give you the tools. We'll show you how to do it, but work together and look what you can build. And if we only have an hour, I think that's what we tell them. It's like, look, everything's going to come to an end, but don't worry. We were at a point worse than this before. You'll get back here. Just give it another try.
Danielle?
Yeah, I guess it'd be something like that ending that just send a message to them that says, we were here before you. Now it's your turn. When it's your time to go, tell whoever comes after you that you were there before them and that now it's their turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it enough that you'll want to do it again. There's plenty of stuff we've unearthed here that we could move into different topics. I still kind of go back to Dave's UFO experience, and that's still the idea that they blink out of existence when you're not looking at them. That really suggests to me that something very different is going on with this phenomenon, whatever it is. So I would definitely love to explore that again down the road. But thank you again for coming. I appreciate it. And I look forward to
persevered, Danielle.
What's that, Dave?
I'm glad you persevered through all the interference that you suffered.
Yeah, me too. I had a lot of fun on the show. I'd love to do it again.